welcome to the next talk by Jeremy about GNOME metapackaging. Enjoy.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Bicha. I work for Canonical. I joined them in January. I specifically work on the Ubuntu desktop team. I do traditional Debian packaging, Debian style packaging for Ubuntu. It's mainly the GNOME packages and other packages that surround it. So it involves bug fixing, packaging the new versions of software, integration to make sure that all the pieces work well together. And I also do a lot of that work on the Debian side also with the Debian GNOME team. I've been contributing to GNOME packaging for Debian and Ubuntu since 2011. So this talk is about the GNOME meta packages in Debian. When I scheduled this talk, I was hoping that there would be more people from my team here, and so there'd be more of a discussion about that. But I think I'm the only one, so I think this. So I'm not exactly sure how this discussion will go, but I think we'll just discuss related topics. So if you have questions about Debian GNOME packaging, this would be a good time for that. But to give you a moment to think of questions, if you don't have them, I'll go and talk about a little bit about what the GNOME meta packages look like. So GNOME Core is the name that GNOME upstream, the GNOME desktop environment, calls the recommended set of components that they recommended for distros to include by default. I don't believe that any distro actually ships it exactly as GNOME recommends. The biggest exception is that GNOME has its own web browser, Epiphany, built on WebKit GTK. And it's a good browser, it's just that Firefox and Chromium are better, and they can do more things. But Epiphany is still being worked on, and it gets better every year. So in Debian, exit out of this slideshow for a moment. This is from Salsa. The source package name is meta-gnome 3. It was named that when GNOME 3 was released in 2011, which is when I got started helping out with packaging. And in the source package, then there's individual binary packages. The first one in this list is GNOME Core, which is designed to resemble GNOME Core from upstream. And so one of the things that I want to do in the next few weeks, few months, is to update this to better match what GNOME is recommending in its current versions, because it changes over time. So I gave some links in here as a kind of a reminder to where this information can be found. So I have some other tabs here. This is a Git repository on GNOME's GitLab. Debian uses Salsa, which is GitLab, and so this interface looks similar. In my preferences, I have it colored blue because that's more of a GNOME color, and I have the Salsa one red, but different people have different colors for it. And so they have a system called BuildStream that they use to build packages. BuildStream is packaged in Debian. It's mainly used by GNOME and I believe the free desktop SDKs, which are used for Flatpak packaging, but it's not widely used elsewhere. And so they have different meta components here. So if we look at this one, this has the basic things for the GNOME Core shell. So it has different names here. Let's see if I can make it a little bit bigger to make it more readable. So there's different names there. And the GNOME Core meta package is a little bit complicated because it's made out of this meta package. It's made out of this other one that has utilities in it. And then these packages have other dependencies that are in other meta packages. Some of the dependencies are maintained by GNOME, some are maintained by other developers. One thing that helps to make it more readable, the GNOME release set is Debian has a tracker maintained by Fred Peters, and it shows for GNOME 42, it shows what GNOME has released in its point releases, in its latest point release, and what the Debian version is that goes along with that corresponding one. So this I find to be a lot more readable than the raw meta packages. So this is probably what we would base the core meta package on. So that's the GNOME core meta package. The next meta package is the GNOME meta package. This is what you get when you install Debian Desktop. When you click the desktop option, there's a checkbox for GNOME, but if you don't check anything, it'll assume you want GNOME anyway, and it'll give you GNOME. So the first dependency is GNOME core, so it includes everything in the GNOME core set, plus some other pieces. So desktop base is it's got artwork and other Debian customizations to make your system look a little more like Debian. And then some other apps that we wanted to be installed by default that weren't part of GNOME core. So there's quite a bit there. Did anyone have any questions so far? My next slide here is I think that we should add an additional meta package beyond these two. The GNOME core set has a lot of apps, has a lot of features, and some people don't want all of those. And so we need something that's smaller than GNOME core. We're going to still use the core name because that's what GNOME calls it, upstream. But I was thinking that we could name this maybe GNOME-Essentials or something. It's always been possible for you to ignore these meta packages and install a more minimal GNOME yourself. You'd have to get GNOME shell. You probably need GNOME Control Center. You have to pick and choose the pieces, and I think it may be more useful to have a meta package to make it easier for people to have a more minimal GNOME experience. So I think we'll add one more this cycle. Going back to the list here, if you notice, it says depends. So in dependencies, you have depends and you have recommends. And recommends are soft dependencies, which means you can uninstall them and you still have the main meta package installed. But for depends, they're hard dependencies. If you say that you don't want the web browser installed and you uninstall the web browser, it will also uninstall the GNOME core meta package, which means then you don't get any of the benefits of the GNOME core updates anymore of what the recommended set is. So virtually everything is a hard dependency, and this was done several years ago. Different people were active on the Debian GNOME team then, and Debian has a tradition of people not installing recommends by default. They had this idea that they could have a slimmer system, less bloat, and so it used to be recommended a lot. Oh, set app to never install recommends, and you'll have a faster system. And the Debian GNOME team disagreed with that. That you're losing important dependencies, and when people set that and not knowing what they're missing, then they have a lot of missing features, and so they'll file bugs at some point saying, "Hey, why doesn't this work? This is supposed to be a feature of this," and it's you didn't install this recommended dependency. So it's a bit of a difficult challenge. We want the features to work, but we maybe don't want the dependencies to be harder than necessary. The Ubuntu desktop meta package has a lot of things as only recommends. So it's interesting that it has worked well enough for Ubuntu that they're okay with making things recommends. So I'm thinking that we may lower some things to recommends also. The specific example I have is the web browser line. That's not expected. Okay. On the web browser line, it has Firefox ESR, which is the only version of Firefox available in Debian for Debian stable. On unstable, there's also Firefox itself. The line in between is showing that you can pick any of the things from this line. That it's alternatives. And then Chromium, and in Ubuntu, it still has the older package name as Chromium Browser, because people use these meta packages on Ubuntu sometimes. Even though they're not what Ubuntu uses by default, they're available. And then Epiphany Browser. And I helped build this line years ago. My philosophy was if someone has a Debian desktop system, then they ought to have at least one good open source web browser installed. But things have changed over the past few years. Now, a lot of people are getting a web browser from a Snap or Flatpak package. And if you have a Snap or Flatpak, then you don't need to have an apt version of the browser installed. Maybe the same browser, it can be confusing. It's unnecessary to make it a dependency. People would like to remove the apt one to use the probably faster releases by using this alternative channel. And apt doesn't, this Debian packaging doesn't have a good way of having dependencies on Snap or Flatpak packages. So the best we can do is to lower that to a recommends then. That's something that there were a bunch of bug reports over the years on, and we always closed them because we thought this was a good idea, but things have changed, so we're willing to change along with them. Yeah, go ahead. Can we get a microphone first, though?
Here you specify a browser. Why not the Google Chrome and Firefox both provides www browser? Why not just depend on that?
Okay, yes. I'll go ahead and rephrase the question, too. You were asking why are we depending on specific browsers instead of the www browser, which is a
provides.
Yeah, it's a provides. I'm trying to think of the apt name for it. A virtual package. Yes. At the time, we were opinionated. We were like, we want the browser to be packaged in Debian, and these were the only GNOME browsers that were packaged in Debian. So Google Chrome is packaged outside of Debian.
And it also provides www browser.
Yes. And we have gotten bug reports on that. And so, yeah, one of the purposes of this is a birds of feather session, so it's to get feedback and discussion. So that's something that I'll make a note of, and we may go ahead and do that too. The recommends also sort of fixes the problem, but that would probably make good sense too. Yeah, at one point, not everything was using www browser, and yeah.
One thing is that
Yeah, go ahead, Rhonda.
www browser includes text mode browsers, and when you're using GNOME, you don't want to fall back on links as being the default browser you would be using.
And because of how Debian packaging works, you can get W3M or links installed by something at a much lower level, and so that was historically why. I believe there's a virtual package, a GNOME-ww browser. I don't have it in front of me, but once again, there's some. Not every browser was even using that, but that maybe could help to have more of a GUI graphical browser.
I just looked into what Firefox ESR is providing, and it provides a virtual package named GNOME www browser.
Yes,
So
that
might
was, so we may do that. We'll take that in there into consideration then.
Thank you.
How much overlap is there now between the Debian GNOME Core package and upstream GNOME Core? Is it close, or is it?
It's somewhat, well, it's kind of drifted over time. It's, I had last year updated a few dependencies, but there's some changes. So as an example, one of the first ones I see is Caribou. It's not in that list, but maybe it's a utility that's still needed. Caribou is an on-screen keyboard, and it may not be required to be in the. See, it's not on this list at all. It may not be required to be installed that way. Maybe it uses the library instead of the app. But that's an example of one of them. In the GNOME 42 release, which is the current stable release, and it's available in Debian testing now, the default text editor switched from gedit to GNOME text editor. So we also made that change in Debian. I left gedit as an alternative. gedit has more plugins and more features. GNOME text editor has a few newer features. It's an interesting app to try both of them and see which you like better. There's a second one, the line right above where I am. The terminal app also changed to GNOME Console instead of GNOME Terminal. GNOME Console is not quite ready to be the default in Debian. This is GNOME Console here, and this is GNOME Text Editor, and this one. I'm running on Ubuntu. It's similar to Debian, but so one example of a difference is if you change your directory to something and you open a new tab, it doesn't open in the current working directory, which is something that GNOME Terminal has. And I think most terminal emulators have, and people expect that. So it worked in GNOME Terminal, this bottom one, and it did not work in GNOME Console. But that was fixed. That particular issue, there was a merge proposal for it upstream to fix this, so that it works on Debian. And I have the merge proposal submitted to the Salsa branch. I'm not one of the maintainers of it. And I'll need to follow up on that because it's not been uploaded to Debian yet.
I think that's configurable in GNOME Terminal, isn't it? That it opens new tabs in the same directory it was before. I think there's a setting for that, but I might be wrong. But what you're referring to is
Serve
the
working
GNOME
directory.
console
That may be this line right here, actually.
Yes. But GNOME Console doesn't have this feature at all. That's what you meant.
It was a bug, actually. It works on other distros. Debian, I'm not familiar enough with technical details to explain it in detail, but Debian sources the bash. This is all using bash, which is the default in Debian. Sources it in a different way than some other distros do, and so there needs to be more of a workaround to work the same way Debian works. I showed you briefly, I had opened all of the GNOME terminal settings, and there's a lot of them. In GNOME Console, there's no settings. You have a choice of a theme, you have nice zooming, and that's it. There's a few options in G settings that you can maybe use the DebConf editor app to find those settings, but there's hardly any settings. And this was a concern for Fedora also. So Fedora, I said before that I don't believe any distro ships GNOME core exactly like GNOME recommends. And so Fedora, in their recent stable release, shipped GNOME text editor, but they kept GNOME terminal as the default terminal app. They're requesting additional settings be added. For instance, they wanted profiles, for you to be able to set different profiles for different, so you could have it do different features. I don't use a terminal that heavily like that. They wanted the option to change color schemes. The color scheme feature, a Canonical developer proposed a merge proposal for adding some color scheme changes. He didn't add settings for it yet. There's discussion about what the settings page would look like. But that will probably be in the next, in the GNOME 43 release. I think that GNOME console will be good enough for the next stable to be installed by default. But it's running close on time, so it's hard to say which one we'll choose. We probably need to have it in place by the time things start freezing. So I'm thinking like December or January. Let me look up the what the schedule says. We would want to do that kind of thing by the initial freeze, like January 12th. But I think it could be argued that it could be changed later if it wasn't good enough in one of the later freezes for that. We like to try to have the system be mostly like we intend to release it by the January freeze. The new GNOME console app supports the dark theme preference introduced in GNOME 42, and the older one doesn't support that natively. And the GNOME console developers seem more interested in GNOME design and overall direction than GNOME terminal. There's not a lot of difference between them, but there's a few differences that seem more useful that way. While I'm here, let me show you one other feature. When you SSH, it changes the color to purple. And I'm here because let's see if there was anybody that had any questions on IRC. Yep, no one has. Let's see what else we had. I already talked about the browser dependency. There's a few more meta packages in the meta GNOME free set. There's a meta package called GNOME-games. These are small, simple games. And I left a note here. So historically, GNOME had the collection of games, and it was all they were all distributed together as a single package called GNOME Games. And then they later decided, okay, let's split these off, which is convenient for them to have different release schedules. And so they were all split off. But it was convenient to be able to install all the games at once. So we kept sort of a transitional package in a way for GNOME games to install these. There was a few that were added later, like there's a 2048 app that were never part of the old GNOME games, but it's a similar style to the other games, and so we added that along with it. There's another app. GNOME ended up having an app that they called GNOME Game. It used the same project name as the old thing, but it was a completely different project. We packaged it in Debian as GNOME Games app. And let's see if this screenshot is useful. So GNOME Games app was a launcher for different apps, and it also had support for different emulators to be able to launch older games if you somehow manage to find an older game where you had the correct license to be able to do that kind of thing. But interesting app. It's not as well maintained right now, so it's not getting new features, but the app still works. The name was actually changed upstream, but they never did a release with the new name. I don't even remember offhand what the name of it was. Something like Arcade or something. You could, here, we've got time. We can see if we can find it. I don't think the redirect was set up for it. Oh, here it is. High Score is what it was called too. But they've never done a release of it with that name. Looking for tags. So the 40.0 release was still called GNOME Games. So I mean, if you rename something but never release it, is it really renamed? Going back in the metapackage here. Yeah, these other ones were here for historical reasons. I'm going to skip that one for a moment. We had one GNOME-devel, and I figured that one should resemble this other metapackage. So let me find that one. It's this one right here. This one maybe is a good example of differences. So let me see if I can show both on the same screen. Okay, so there are differences here between these two sets. On the GNOME side, they have one app that's not in Debian yet called dspy. I think that is sort of a replacement for an app called dfeat, which allows you to look at dbus messaging and send dbus messaging, which is kind of a behind-the-scenes way for different apps to communicate and send signals to each other to do certain actions. I'm asking my own question. Okay, why is it not in Debian yet? So let's go look into these. Let's go find dspy. It's a little weird that it's. Oh, okay. It's got a hyphen in the name. It says it's written in C. I think that we just didn't get around to packaging it yet. I'll get to dependencies briefly. Yeah, I don't see any major reason why this wasn't packaged. We just never got around to it yet. So all of the rest of these are over here. Sysprof we had as a suggest. On the GNOME side, GNOME Builder includes Sysprof support. Sysprof helps with debugging. Has anyone in here used Sysprof? Anybody familiar with it? To be able to describe it better than I can. It's a debugging app, but its functionality as a library is built into GNOME Builder, and so it may be on the meta package to say that the source package should be a developer tool, but because its functionality is built there, it doesn't need to necessarily be a separate app. So that's why I didn't have it as a dependency on this side. Also, currently, GNOME Builder has a dependency on Sysprof because we haven't split Sysprof into separate library packages yet, which we'll also try to do this cycle. We have a few things on this side that aren't there, though. We have Axerciser, maybe can help with accessibility support if you're developing an app to see accessibility information about the different widgets. I don't think it's used very much at all. Another app is GitG. It's a graphical Git history viewer. It's not as powerful as using Git from the command line, but it can be a good way to be able to visualize some changes in an easier way, though. Glade was historically used as a way to build the user interface of an app. So if you were familiar with Windows development with Visual Studio, where you can drag widgets around when you're building your app, Glade has not been updated for GTK4 yet, and Glade is an older app, and it adds maybe too much. It creates more verbose files than it needs to on the UI files. It adds a lot of extra lines in the XML, some of which aren't necessary. Some maybe or maybe not what would be recommended, really, because it's adding extra information. So it's sort of minimally maintained. It's not the best, but there isn't another app that does what it does, though, really. I think GNOME Builder, which is a developer tool sort of like a Visual Studio, I think it has the Glade library built into it, so you can do some Glade work without having the Glade app installed separately. But so when there's differences, we'll have to think about if we should drop some of these, if we should add additional metapackage like GNOME Devel extras to have these other things that maybe are useful. Maybe it could just be suggest. Can we have a microphone?
So I'm not sure in GNOME, in Debian GNOME team or in one desktop or in your hub maybe, is there any timetable for the GTK2 deprecation? Will that be happening in this release? I mean, will be or before the release or?
Are you talking about the GTK2 removal?
Yes, removal, yes.
Removal. It will not be removed this release at all.
Okay, got it.
I'm still trying to get DebConf removed, which was before G settings. I came very close a few years ago, but Debian is a big project, and we agree on fundamental things. We have the Debian Free Software Guidelines. We have the Debian Constitution. We have fundamental things we agree on, and then there's other issues that we don't always agree on. And in this particular case, my work to remove GConf came up against another developer who represented. He's not the only one that has this opinion, but there's some developers think that ancient apps that maybe don't work as well, or maybe they're not needed for a modern system, that it's useful for Debian to remove these unmaintained things, many of which have been abandoned upstream maybe a decade ago. And Debian is like the last maintainer of these apps. So I'm okay with those being removed, to be able to remove old libraries like gconf, because I don't think we should maintain that anymore, because people should be using more modern ways like G settings, or they could go back to using a different framework like INI files, having another way to store their configuration. Another philosophy is that part of Debian's value comes from having available as much software as possible. And even if only a very few people are using this old app, as long as somebody finds it useful, then it should be still available even in the latest Debian release. So it's a conflict there. And so this developer went and decided to maintain GConf himself, and we let him do that. So there's still maybe 5 packages or so that are using GConf. GTK2 has a lot more things using it, and some of them are things that people use a lot. One example is GIMP, the image editing app, and there's a port to GTK3. It was recently packaged for experimental, but it's upstream still considers it to be a beta. It's not a stable release, and it doesn't look like they plan to do a stable release this year. So in Debian, we have a choice of whether to take this beta release that has a lot more cool features that people would like, but it's a beta and not intended to be supported long-term by upstream or by anybody. And I don't know what our decision will be on that. We're waiting to see the next GIMP point release in that development series. It's the 2.99 series. And to see what they put in their release announcement, to see how they describe things. Looks like we have about 10 minutes left, so if anyone has any additional questions, now's a great time to ask that. Yeah, there's just way too much stuff using GTK2. We filed bugs about a lot of them, but it's not urgent bugs at all. They're not release critical. Yeah, so on GTK4 has been released. There were proposals years ago to have new GTK releases like every year, very quickly, but it looks like reality is that that's not how that's happening. It's much slower release schedule. So GTK5 is probably a few years away. We're not expecting apps like Firefox and LibreOffice to switch to GTK4 anytime soon. Firefox in particular, because they use, they pretty much have their own custom widgets anyway. They only use GTK very minimally. And GTK3 gave them high DPI support. It had some useful modernizations, so that was important. But GTK4 is a more minor release for a project like Firefox. I was a bit ambitious, and I signed up to do some more talks this week. On Wednesday, I'm doing a talk about Debian and Ubuntu GNOME teams, how we work together. So I'm going to talk a bit about the history of Debian and Ubuntu GNOME and how we work together. We use Salsa together for our packaging. So I think that'll be an interesting talk. It's been something that's been on my mind for a while that I thought other people might find it interesting. And then I have a short talk on Saturday about what's new in GNOME since the last Debian stable release, which shipped GNOME 3.38, and now we're shipping GNOME 42, on track to have GNOME 43 in place for the next stable. GNOME 43 will be released in September, so just a few months from now, and that gives time for it to be stabilized and in place. By the time we release the next Debian stable, GNOME 44 will be out, but with our freeze process, it's definitely not going to be in the next Debian stable. I think that was all I had. So I may actually let you guys go early, unless anyone else has any questions.
Unrelated to the topic, but recently I was looking into how to do tests for like GNOME running, like GNOME launching an application and blah blah blah. There is Linux something testing that uses accessibility fields to like click buttons and stuff in the interface. Okay. Is there any tool you would recommend? Do you know any tool that can be used for similar testing, because that tool I have found still uses Python 2, so it needs to be ported to Python 3 first. So the goal is to do tests of GNOME applications. Just check that they run.
Yes.
Do you have any suggestions on how it can be done?
Okay. Yeah, keep the mic on in case I need to clarify with you. So you're asking about a way to test a graphical application.
Yes.
Right. On one side, we don't have great tools for that, and so we have build test for libraries, but for the most part, we don't have them for apps. But let me give you a few ideas on that. There is there's something with the dog in it. No, not dog. There's a Python library. What app was using this? Okay, I'll come back to that one in a moment. There's another tool that was developed by OpenSUSE. It's called OpenQA. And this is actually, I don't know what the app is. Maybe it's Debian.net. Yeah. There is a talk about this in a previous DebConf, so you can find a video for it. And I unfortunately have not watched a video, so I don't understand OpenQA a lot. But there are, let me try to quickly see if we can pull something up here. I feel like it's partially based, so it takes screenshots as it goes. And I feel like this is partially based on screenshots, that the screenshot resembles the reference image. But I don't have a lot of details on that, but that's something to look into more. It's very interesting. Ubuntu does not use this at all, but Debian has it available. It's like an unofficial Debian service, so bugs could be reported, but it's not part of our normal release testing process.
How do you go about ensuring that the applications actually open and work and render correctly before they're released then?
Mm-hmm. I can build the apps locally before I push them into Debian, and then install them and to see if the basic buttons work. I don't do a thorough testing of all of it though.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
While we're waiting here, I'm just going to see if I remember the name of this this other framework. Yeah, I don't remember what that other library is called, but a couple of GNOME apps have used it for testing, but it didn't work well for me. But it is possible to do some graphical testing. I just am not aware of how that's being built. When we do build test, we can run a minimal X environment in our builders, and that is used for some testing, but it's more difficult to have that set up.
The tool I was thinking about was Linux desktop testing project. It actually exists, but the last commit there was 6 years ago.
Okay. Okay. I'm not familiar with that project.
Thank you.
Dogtail, there you go.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
The Python library you're looking for is called Dogtail.
And that was ported to Python free, so it is still available in Debian. Maybe that can help give you a way to test your apps. I hope this talk was interesting. I feel from my side, I feel like maybe it was a little bit boring, but hopefully it was helpful.
So Jeremy,
Thank
thanks
you.
a lot. And yeah, just give him applause.
Thank you.